Assassinating Presidents. Episode 1 is titled Abraham Lincoln, and I am so excited to kick off this series with you. Let's dive deep into one of the most infamous crimes in American history.
Okay.
The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It's a story full of intrigue, drama, and tragedy.
It absolutely is.
Wouldn't you say?
And, it's not just the assassination itself that's captivating. It's the context, the aftermath, the ripple effects that make this event so compelling even today.
Okay, let's set the scene for our listeners then. It's April 14th, 1865. The Civil War has just ended. A wave of relief and jubilation is sweeping the nation. Can you paint a picture of what the atmosphere was like in Washington, D.C. on that fateful night?
Well, imagine this Ford's Theater is packed, buzzing with excitement, a full house, 1,700 people eager to see the hit comedy, Our American Cousin. The city is alive with a sense of hope and renewal. It's almost palpable.
And at the center of it all is President Lincoln, attending the theater with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln.
Exactly. And his presence adds another layer of excitement to the evening. Remember, this is a time when presidents weren't shrouded in the kind of security we see today. People could get close to Lincoln. They felt a connection with him.
And what about security that night? Was there anything unusual about the arrangements?
Well, in hindsight, it's striking how casual security was. Lincoln's usual bodyguard wasn't present, and the policeman assigned to guard the presidential box wandered off. A lapse that would have unthinkable consequences.
Now let's talk about the man who orchestrated this tragedy, John Wilkes Booth. He was more than just a famous actor, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. John Wilkes Booth was a fascinating, complex figure, a renowned actor, yes, but also a staunch Confederate sympathizer with ties to a secret society called the Knights of the Golden Circle. They were known for their pro-Confederate stance and their belief in white supremacy.
So Booth was deeply embedded in this network of Confederate loyalists. What drove him to such a drastic act? I mean, the war was over. Why not just accept defeat and move on?
For Booth, it wasn't that simple. He saw Lincoln as a tyrant, a threat to the Southern way of life. He believed Lincoln's policies would destroy the South and its culture. His diary entries reveal a man consumed by a warped sense of patriotism and fueled by rage at the Union's victory.
So this wasn't just about political differences. It was deeply personal for Booth.
Yes, and that rage was further inflamed just days before the assassination. Booth attended Lincoln's final speech, where the president advocated for voting rights for freed slaves. This infuriated Booth, who saw it as a betrayal of the South and a sign that Lincoln had to be stopped at any cost.
So how did Booth plan to carry out his deadly mission? Ford's Theater seems like a pretty public, risky place for an assassination.
Booth was meticulous. He knew the layout of the theater like the back of his hand. He had even performed there numerous times. He strategically chose that venue in a specific moment in the play that would guarantee maximum distraction.
What do you mean? A specific moment in the play?
He waited for a hilarious line, a moment, when the audience would erupt in laughter. The sound of their amusement would mask the gunshot, creating chaos in the aftermath. It was a chillingly calculated plan. And that moment arrived during a line delivered by the actor Harry Hawk. As the audience roared with laughter, Booth seized his chance. He slipped into the presidential box, barricaded the door, and waited.
He had actually prepared for this moment earlier in the day, hadn't he?
That's right. He'd bored a peek hole into the door so he could observe Lincoln and time his shot perfectly. It's almost like something out of a spy thriller, the level of planning and precision involved.
So Booth is in the box, the audience is distracted, and Lincoln is completely unaware of the danger lurking just feet away. What happened next?
Booth steps forward, aims his .44 derringer pistol at the back of Lincoln's head, and fires. The sound of the shot is lost in the laughter and applause.
You can't imagine the shock and horror that must have ripped through the theater. 1 minute, they're enjoying a lighthearted comedy. The next, the president is slumped over in his chair, mortally wounded.
It was utter chaos. Mary Todd Lincoln screamed, Clara Harris fainted, and Major Rathbone, realizing what had happened, lunged at Booth, desperately trying to stop him from escaping.
But Booth, fueled by adrenaline, and let's face it, a twisted sense of purpose, was ready for a fight.
He slashed at Rathbone with a knife, injuring his arm, before leaping from the box to the stage 12 feet below.
12 feet? That's a risky move even for a trained actor. Did he get hurt?
Amazingly, no. He landed awkwardly, catching his boot spur on a flag draped below the box. Some witnesses even said he cried out in pain as he landed, but he quickly recovered.
And what about the audience? Surely they realized what had happened by then.
It's strange, but initially many thought it was part of the play. After all, this was John Wilkes Booth, a renowned actor. They were used to seeing him command attention on stage.
But the reality must have sunk in pretty quickly,
Yeah.
especially when they saw Booth brandishing a bloody knife.
Exactly. As he stood there on stage, some witnesses say he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," the Virginia state motto meaning thus always to tyrants. Although there's debate about what he actually said. Some only heard "Sic semper," while others claimed he yelled, "The South is avenged."
Regardless of his exact words, the message was clear. A dramatic statement solidifying his place in history as the man who struck down the president.
It was a desperate act by a man who truly believed he was a hero, a patriot striking a blow for a lost cause. But in reality, he was a fanatic who plunged a nation into mourning.
So Booth escapes the theater, fleeing into the night. Did he have a getaway plan? You'd think with all the commotion he wouldn't get far.
Oh, he had planned his escape meticulously. He'd stashed a getaway horse at the back of the theater. He jumped into the saddle, knocked a stagehand to the ground, and galloped away.
The daring escape, to say the least. But meanwhile, back in the theater, people are rushing to Lincoln's aid. Can you describe what happened next?
A young army surgeon, Dr. Charles Leal, was among the first to reach the president. He immediately recognized the severity of the wound. A bullet lodged behind Lincoln's left ear.
A fatal injury.
He knew it was dire. They carried Lincoln to a nearby boarding house, the Peterson House, hoping to provide some comfort in his final hours.
What a somber image. Carrying a dying president across the street, a nation holding its breath, hoping against hope.
Inside the Peterson House, doctors worked tirelessly, but it was clear Lincoln's wound was beyond saving. Cabinet members and other officials gathered, keeping vigil as the president slipped away.
And who took charge of the situation? The government was essentially in a state of paralysis at this point.
Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took command. He directed the hunt for Booth-issued orders and essentially ran the government from Lincoln's bedside.
A nation in shock, its leader clinging to life in a stranger's bed, and his successor nowhere to be found. What a terrifying and confusing time that must have been.
It was a moment of profound uncertainty and grief. And as dawn broke on April 15, 1865, surrounded by a handful of close confidants, Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. He was just 56 years old.
The nation plunged into mourning. But the story doesn't end there. The hunt for John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators was just beginning. And that's where things get even more intriguing.
Absolutely. Wouldn't you say?
Booth wasn't alone in this plot. He had assembled a group of Confederate sympathizers, each assigned a specific target, a coordinated attack aimed at crippling the Union government.
So tell me more about these co-conspirators. Who were they, and what were their roles in this deadly scheme?
Well, there was Lewis Powell, a young former Confederate soldier, who was assigned to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward.
A coordinated attack aimed at decapitating the government. It's almost hard to fathom the level of chaos they hope to unleash.
It was a bold and desperate plan, reflecting the desperation of a lost cause. But fortunately, those attacks weren't as successful as Booth's.
So what happened? Did they get cold feet? Well, Powell did manage to break into Seward's home. He severely wounded the Secretary of State. But Seward ultimately survived. As for George Atzerodt, the man tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson.
Let me guess. He chickened out.
It seems that way. Either he lost his nerve or perhaps he developed a fondness for the bar. He ended up getting drunk and wandering the streets of Washington instead of carrying out his assigned task.
Talk about a stroke of luck for Vice President Johnson. So, back to Booth. What happened after his daring escape from Ford's Theater? Did they catch him?
The manhunt for Booth was massive, the largest in U.S. history up to that point. Thousands of federal troops and countless civilians were on the lookout, driven by outrage and grief over Lincoln's assassination. For 12 days, Booth and his accomplice, David Harold, evaded capture, relying on a network of Confederate sympathizers to help them hide.
So they were on the run.
Yeah.
Desperate and increasingly paranoid, I imagine.
Exactly. They moved through swamps, forests, and back roads, always looking over their shoulders, knowing the net was closing in. Finally, they were cornered in a barn in Virginia.
Cornered in a barn. Sounds like a classic Wild West showdown.
It was quite dramatic. The soldiers surrounded the barn and set it on fire, hoping to force Booth out. Harold surrendered, but Booth refused. He was determined to go down fighting, still clinging to his warped beliefs.
So how did it end?
A shot rang out from the back of the barn. Sergeant Boston Corbett, claiming he saw Booth aiming his weapon, fired a single shot hitting Booth in the neck.
A fitting end for a man who brought so much violence and sorrow to a nation yearning for peace.
Booth died a few hours later, uttering those famous last words, "Useless. Useless. A haunting epitaph for a man whose actions had such devastating consequences.
And what became of his co-conspirators?
They were all captured and put on trial by a military tribunal, 4 of them, including Mary Surratt. The owner of the boarding house where Booth and his accomplices planned the attacks, were sentenced to death by hanging.
Mary Surratt, a woman involved in this plot.
Yes, her role is still debated by historians to this day. Some believe she was a willing participant, fully aware of the assassination plot. Others argue she was merely a pawn, manipulated by Booth and unaware of his true intentions.
A fascinating and tragic figure caught in the crosshairs of history. And the others. What happened to them?
The remaining conspirators received varying prison sentences. Some were later pardoned, but their lives were forever marked by their association with this horrific crime.
And what about John Surratt? The outline mentioned his escape and capture.
Ah, yes. John Surratt, Mary's son, managed to flee the country and remained at large for nearly 2 years. He was eventually apprehended in Egypt and brought back to the United States to stand trial. However, the jury deadlocked, and he was ultimately released.
So he escaped justice altogether. What a twist. It seems this story is full of surprises and lingering questions.
It is, isn't it? The assassination of Abraham Lincoln remains a pivotal moment in American history, a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the enduring power of individual actions to shape the course of events.
It's a story that continues to fascinate and haunt us, prompting us to reflect on the complexities of history and the human capacity for both good and evil. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this deeply compelling event.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you for having me on Crime 11.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Until next time, keep those detective hats on and stay curious.